Chapter 56, Thicker Than Water. A gnome filled the basin before him and stooped to splash the cold water across his face. The night had been a restless one, his dreams haunted by a young woman who seemed to be Fritha and his sister by turns, though in each case she was distressed with a misery he could do nothing to alleviate, and he had awoken late, feeling dull and at odds with himself. Outside, the morning looked bright and clear, the slums already awake, and the street under his window was full of bustle. He watched the people a moment, feeling somehow distant from it all. Yesterday, all his hopes had at last come to pass, and yet not in any way he had once imagined they would. He thought he would feel different now the order had accepted him as a knight, but he did not. He was very happy, of course. How could he not be when he had finally achieved something he had been working towards almost his whole life? But, for all that, he still felt the same in himself. Perhaps that was what Fritha had been driving at all along, whether knight or squire, he was still the same man. Fritha. She had helped him so much in the time they had travelled together, and it pained him now to know she was going through some similarly distressing trial alone. A gnome sighed. She had always seemed fine on the surface, but lately he had been allowed glimpses of a deeper melancholy that lingered just behind the smile, and he wondered how long she had been so troubled. Perhaps from even their very first meeting. The thought was not a pleasant one. He turned away from the window, drawing his attention back to the dresser to gaze a moment at the small mirror above it, his reflection showing none of the tiredness he felt. Though not in any way hungover, he certainly wasn't feeling his best, and considering the state she had returned in last night, he imagined Fritha would be suffering much worse. He dropped his gaze to where his pack rested by the door, staring contemplatively at it a moment, before he hauled it onto the dresser and was taking out various herbs and powders to quickly prepare her something for the pain. Out in the hallway, he faced almost the same hesitance as he had the previous evening, though a gnome made himself knock, her voice quiet but audible on the other side of the door. "Come in." Fritha was already up and dressed. The girl sat at her dresser, a large jug and cup which he suspected were full of water next to her as she very slowly pulled a comb through her hair as though every movement was agony. "Ah, hello a gnome. Good morning, my lady, how are you feeling?" She offered him a tight smile. "Not too clever. You?" "Fine. I drank quite a bit of water before I slept." "Gods, I wish I had," she sighed with feeling, laying down her comb to sink her head into her hands. A gnome swallowed, the paper smooth under his fingers as he placed the thin envelope on the dresser next to her. "Yes, I thought you might be feeling a little off color this morning. I prepared you this, my lady. Take it with water, it should help." Fritha stared down at the small square of parchment, looking close to tears in her relief. "Oh a gnome, I could kiss you, though my breath would likely leave you reeling." He would have liked to have said he did not mind, but the words stuck in his throat. Fritha turned to him with a weak smile, raising her cup high in salute. "To your health and mine." She emptied the powder straight onto her tongue and downed the water in one long draught, her smile lingering as she turned back to the mirror. "So, is this kindness a sly opening to my promised admonishments then?" "Admonishments?" he repeated before recalling her teasing the previous night. He smiled. "Well, I fear it would be a touch hypocritical of me to comment, since I actually arrived back here at about the same hour you did." He watched her as she laughed. "Goodness, a knighthood, and it's as though you are a whole new person." He smiled at that, taking a seat on the bed behind her to wait for her to finish dressing her hair, the girl leaning back slightly to gather it up and twisting it into a rope that she coiled at her crown, just as he had seen his sister do many times before her, before she took up her 2 wooden pins from the dresser to secure it in place. He watched as she tried to tidy the shorter curls at her temples, frowning at her reflection and clearly not very pleased with what she saw, before she finally seemed to give it up as a lost cause and turned to catch him looking.
Is something the matter? No, nothing, my lady. Merely that, for a moment, you reminded me of my sister.
Frithha sent him an understanding smile.
You must still think of her a lot.
Anomen swallowed, the pain of the loss still keen even after so long.
Yes, it can be hard. I try to remember Moira as she was, celebrate the life she had, but I cannot help but think on the person she could have grown to be, all those experiences which are now denied to her. I wish you could have met her, my lady, I am sure she would have liked you.
Frith's smile broadened.
I'm sure I would have liked her too.
Anomen nodded slowly.
It is especially difficult for my dwelling upon the idea that had I known there was a problem, I could have perhaps been able to prevent it.
He sent her a searching look.
Frithha, if there is ever anything you would wish to talk about then I would hope you know that I am always at hand.
Frithha was frowning, a disheartening mix of bemused and uncomfortable.
Ah, well, thank you, Anomen. Come.
She sighed at last, making to stand.
I supposed we should face the day.
She pushed back her chair and stood, perhaps a touch too quickly, the girl drawing in a sharp breath and cradling her head as she winced, blinking furiously through the pain.
Oh, I am never drinking again. Anomen, how long before this draft kicks in?
He smiled slightly, both sad and happy in the same instance.
Not long, my lady.
The common room was busy enough to remind Jahara why she usually had her breakfast much earlier, the air filled with the low rumble of voices and the clatter of cutlery as the patrons took their first meal of the day, and the clamorous noise of civilization grated on her. She had her long overdue meeting with Galvary to face that morning, and it was something she was not looking forward to, though at least the morning had afforded one fortunate event so far, the Druid finding herself alone at their table, allowing her to enjoy her first cup of tea in solitude and find her center as she waited for the others. Not that she was particularly surprised by this occurrence, she knew for a fact at least 3 of their company had not returned before midnight. Speaking of which...
Good morning, my ptarmigan,
came a voice at her elbow, the woman glancing up to see Herr Dallas looking brighter than she would have expected.
Good morning, I did not expect to see you for a while, considering you and Frithha were out carousing until the early hours.
Herr Dallas looked surprised.
You have spoken with the Raven already? No, but I had not long retired myself last night. I heard you and Frithha laughing in the hallway.
Herr Dallas heaved a sigh as he took the chair next to her.
And you were not the only one.
Jahara raised an eyebrow.
Let me guess, I suppose Ari heard your return as well, did she?
The tiefling nodded, smiling grimly.
Oh, yes. I imagine she will be speaking to me again by midwinter.
Jahara snorted, amused by his honesty.
Love ever was a fool's game,
she sighed, smiling as Frithha appeared on the stairs, the night closed behind her.
Ah, and here are 2 more I did not expect to see before noon.
The bard glanced up as well.
So it is, and I'll wager you a gold piece that Anomen is wearing that new blade of his again this day.
Jahara smiled wryly as they came into a clearer view, a nomen's ceremonial sword conspicuous only in its absence.
It would seem you are out of luck, Bard. That's just because it is still under his pillow where he slept the night with it,
the bard muttered sullenly, reaching for his purse. Jahara tried not to laugh, though she did not do very well, the woman snorting into her tea, Herr Dallas sending her a shining smile as he called out to them.
Good morning, my raven, and the newly knighted hound too. Morning,
Fritha greeted as she reached the table, the girl sending the bard a frown.
Bloody hells, Herr Dallas, you look a bit sprightly. If I could have guessed at anyone who would feel worse than me this morning, it would have been you.
Herr Dallas shrugged unconcernedly.
Oh, I am not one who suffers from the after effects of such vinous revels.
Fritha looked highly put out by this injustice.
You Jamagit! You could have mentioned that before you were encouraging us to drown ourselves in juniper spirits. And look at that!
She cried, pushing up her sleeve to show them a couple of dark purple bruises staining her forearm.
I'm covered in them. What the bloody hells were we doing last night? Nothing that should have caused those, though if you are pained I'm sure I can do something to help,
he added with a roguish grin that soon faded as Ari arrived at the table with Minsk. Fritha sent him a wry smile as the pair took their chairs, Ari taking the seat as far from Herr Dallas as space would allow.
Morning Ari, morning Minsk, and thank you for the offer Herr Dallas, but you're quite all right, a noman arrived with a draft this morning. Did he indeed?
Confirmed Jahara, sending him a shrewd look, and a noman became suddenly very interested in serving himself some tea.
So, do you two even remember getting back last night?
Continued the druid with a smile. Fritha nodded.
Of course. Well, bits anyway. Nearly tripping on the stairs, Herr Dallas thinking he had lost his key, talking to a noman about singing.
She turned to the knight, suddenly alarmed.
Gods, I didn't give you a rendition in the hallway, did I?
A noman smiled wryly.
Sadly, no, my lady, you said it was against the rules. Thank Millel for that!
She exclaimed over their laughter, glancing up as the last of their group arrived.
Ah, Cerned, finally someone who looks worse than I do. Did you have trouble sleeping?
The druid nodded, his weathered face looking even more worn than usual as he sank stiffly into the remaining empty chair.
I had forgotten how loud the city is even after the sun sets. Even the birds know when to take their rest and keep their silence. And I thought you liked birdsong,
quipped Herr Dallas coolly.
That I do, though the caterwauling of drunks leaves much to be desired. You know there were two, it must have been well past midnight, walking along the street out there just under my window singing I saw my lady weeping at the top of their voices. Really? How very inconsiderate!
Tut Herr Dallas, sending Frith a sly look, the girl hiding her laughter in her teacup.
So what are our plans for the day, my raven? You have to ask.
She laughed, before adding for the benefit of the newcomer,
we will, of course, be looking for work. Now, I have to go to the promenade this morning, so I'll ask about there after I've taken the next installment over to Galen. Perhaps, you could go ask about the temples, a nomen. Well, actually, my lady, there is something I need from the promenade as well.
Fritha looked momentarily surprised, but smiled, and nodded all the same.
Oh, as you will, Ari, can you go in his stead? Of course,
she nodded politely, her manner still slightly stiff. Fritha turned immediately to Jahara.
Good, and perhaps you could go with Cerned to look at the bounties over in the council buildings.
Jahara felt her stomach tighten, the woman finishing her sip of tea before venturing.
Actually, I have my own lines of work to investigate this morning.
Frithis sighed slightly.
Fine, fine. Gods, it's like herding cats. Look, you lot just sort yourselves out then.
And so they did, the rest of them agreeing to ask about the temples together to Frithis' slight displeasure, though with Cern not knowing the city and Ari and Herdalis still not speaking, she had to admit it would have been difficult to make a smaller group. And after their meal, the group parted ways, Minsk leading the majority of them southwest, while Frithis set off through the slums to Galen's house with Inomen, Jahara leaving in the opposite direction, heading towards the docks alone. Herdalis was leant back against the low wall, his gaze fixed on the brilliant streaks of lightning that were ricocheting about the spherical metal cages outside the Temple of Talos. They had not long arrived in the temple district and had just been passing the temple to Lathander when one of the young acolytes on guard outside had recognized Minsk from when the ranger had helped them with their new shrine earlier in the autumn, and the two were still talking earnestly together like friends of old. Ari did not begrudge him the meeting though, and from the way the conversation was going, it would likely end in some work for them. The elf turned from where she was stood with Cern, waiting for them to finish to let her attention drift back to the tiefling. It was so confusing. She and Herdalis had fought so much recently, and yet it was as though she was all the more drawn to him for it, even when he seemed to go out of his way to annoy her. That he had wanted to go to the theater instead of spending some long overdue time with her had hurt, and even as they had argued in her room not long afterwards, she could not tell whether the tiefling truly was sulking with her or that it was merely a fabrication of her own displeasure, the elf subconsciously hoping for another argument in which to vent her anger at the perceived rejection. But wherever the argument had come from, the results were all too plain. The bard immediately leaving for the company of his raven and not returning until the early hours. Ari frowned, feeling something inside her twist as she recalled the pair the night before, whispering and giggling as they had tried to steal back to their rooms together. She was not jealous exactly, but it was hard to watch them getting along so well when she and Herdalis could not seem to go a day at the moment without arguing. He had tried to come and speak with her that morning, but she had still been feeling bitter and ill-humored after a night lain awake, and by his manner now, it did not look as though he was concerned about them making peace anytime soon. And infuriatingly enough, the idea just seemed to make her want to talk to him more. She watched him, sat mildly watching the lightning without a care, and before she had realized it, she had begun to walk over to him, still not sure yet whether she was looking for a reconciliation or another fight. The tiefling glanced up at her approaching, sending her a sincere smile.
"Ah, hello, my dove." "Hello,"
she answered stiffly, following his gaze to the cages merely so she did not have to look him.
"So,"
she began coolly after a long contemplative pause,
"how was your evening last night?"
Herdalis shrugged nonchalantly. If he had noticed her tone, he was ignoring it.
"Oh, it went well enough, though I must say now, I do sympathize with the raven about that playhouse of hers. Higold fusses like an old hen about every little thing in the cast. I am sure we, the Sigil troupe, were never so petty when it came to our art."
Ari did not quite know how to reply to that, instead maintaining her cool tone to offer,
"I think Minsk may have found us some work." "Ah, that is good news."
She glanced to him, his relief unexpected.
"You sound pleased."
He nodded fervently.
"Indeed, for I had worried that Frithis' desperation to raise funds and her dislike of the actors would have combined in some dangerous venture."
Ari frowned, curious in spite of herself.
"How so?" "Well, when we were there last night, she was threatening to sack the entire cast and have our group take over the roles."
Ari snorted with laughter, fighting against a smile even as she shot him a reproachful look.
Don't Don't make me laugh, I'm not ready to forgive you yet.
He smiled, edging closer to her.
Oh, I see. Well, I shall wait then, until your heart is feeling softer.
She giggled again, sighing as she leant back against the wall as well to lay her head against his shoulder.
Oh, why can't we just get along as we used to? Come now, sweet Ari,
Dallas smiled, putting an arm about her.
Do not let a few quarrels distress you so. Other pairings have weathered worse and were better for it afterwards. Yes, I suppose,
she sighed, ignoring the thought that the source of those quarrels, his perverse beliefs and reticence, still remained.
And as for my behavior in all this,
he continued blithely,
I swore to myself last night, that however cross you get with me from now on, I am going to show you naught by my unchanging regard in return. No more shall I lose my temper.
He paused to send her a sly look,
for, indeed, at least one of us should learn how to keep it.
Ari hit his arm lightly as she laughed, the pair glancing up as they heard someone calling to them to see Minsk himself stood in the doorway of the temple beckoning them across.
Ah, they must have reached a decision,
said Ari, straightening to tug at Dallas's sleeve.
Come on. You lead and I will follow, my dove.
Jahara sat on the low bench, the room about her empty barring one other man sat alone as she was, and a man and a woman in the far corner, the quiet talk of the pair echoing about the high marble ceiling. She was at the Harper Hold, sat in the small common room of tables and chairs all in Galvary's overly opulent style where those who wished to meet with the man himself or other contacts could wait in comfort. She was doing neither though. Her meeting with Galvary had ended a quarter hour ago and leaving in her a deep unrest that only one man could alleviate.
Derman,
she greeted in almost a bark, standing as the man finally entered the room. He started at the sound of her voice, glancing about him and smiling as his eyes found her.
Jahara, my dear, I had thought you would be here today. How went your journey to trade meat? Were the Druids there truly the source of the trouble? I know you were worried you could find yourself torn by a conflict of interests. All has been resolved now,
she answered, dropping her voice to add,
Derman, I would speak with you, somewhere private.
The smile flickered a moment and his nod was almost imperceptible.
All resolved you say,
he continued audibly,
and satisfactorily too, I hope. Come, let us to a tavern and I can trade a cup of wine for a tale of your success.
The closest tavern was the Sea's Bounty, a dingy cramped place whose rowdy patronage of sailors and courtesans provided a good cover for those who wished to be overlooked. Jahara leaned across the small table, her hand clenched tightly about the chipped cup of wine Derman had just poured her.
I just had my meeting with Galvary. He said the issue has been dropped, the seniors are simply no longer interested in Fritha.
Derman raised a graying eyebrow.
Well, that is what we were hoping for, was it not? Yes,
Jahara hissed, dropping her voice even lower to the point where she could barely hear herself over the raucous din of the tavern about them.
But the girl is one of the children and suddenly they don't care, just like that.
She shook her head, leaning back in her chair.
It is too sudden, Derman, I don't trust it.
Derman sighed, sending her a contemplative frown before finally leaning forward as she had.
Look, I probably shouldn't be saying anything, for indeed no one is sure of just what is going on, but this new group of Kelvins, well it looks as though they might have been trying to infiltrate back into the Harper ranks to get key information on numbers and safe houses. Truly?
She gasped, hardly able to believe the old mage would attempt something so underhand,
but why?
Derman shrugged darkly.
Who knows? But it's got the seniors looking over their shoulders. To be honest with you, I'm not surprised they've forgotten about your friend with all that to occupy them.
He sent her a searching look.
You're relieved, aren't you?
Jahara nodded gravely.
I cannot deny it, Derman, I am. I know you don't trust Galvary, but he's just following orders, as are we all. Yes, and how many atrocities have been excused under the same defense?
She snapped promptly, his look of surprise instantly invoking her regret.
Forgive me, I did not mean to imply.
But Derman just waved her words away with an sympathetic smile.
No, you were just worried for your friend, I understand. Well, now your fears have been abated.
He continued genially, moving to top up her cup.
Tell me about these druids, then.
Jahara smiled, it was just like old times and it warmed her. Fritha moved deftly through the bustle of the marketplace, her newly purchased boots under her arm. She and Anoman had split up as soon as they had arrived at the promenade. The fact that he had suggested it something which had both surprised and pleased her. Not that she disliked the man's company, but Fritha rather enjoyed going about the market alone, always walking the same route about the myriad of stalls, the solitude allowing her a pleasant hour or so where she could blend into the crowds and pretend she was just like everyone else. She always started at the thick-set merchant's stall in the west of the market, where she would stock up on any supplies she needed before taking the time to inquire after his family and ask if he had heard of any work within the traders' circles. And from there, she would just wander up and down the stalls of cloth and trinkets and books, looking at the treasures she would buy if she had the money and imagining the dresses she would make had she anywhere to wear them. And, at last, she would find herself before the huge fresh fish stall in the southeast of the arena, not for any of the produce, but to enjoy a moment looking at the beautiful Karaduran boy who worked there, his eyebrows as fine as moth's antennae on his smooth sallow face. He had not been there today, but Fritha had not minded, her new purchase the source of much more pleasure than any boy could afford, however pretty. She stroked a hand along the smooth dark brown leather. She would have usually just bought some second-hand boots, but delivering their payment from trade meet to Galen's that morning and realizing they had almost collected half the 20,000 fee, had been hardening. And with winter fast approaching, Fritha felt it would not be unreasonable to pay a little more for some new ones, and she was more than pleased she had. She smiled, pulling her attention from them to gaze across at the western archway where Anoman was waiting atop the steps in the shadow of one of the great stone lions. He had yet to notice her approach and she used the moment to observe him unseen. He carried himself differently now, his usual defiance of the world replaced by a quiet confidence, becoming a knight conferring on him a lot more than just a title, it seemed. He had been acting strangely that morning, not that she was not grateful when he had arrived at her room with the draft for her hangover, but what he had said afterwards. She could not recall saying anything so terrible to him the night before that he should feel he needed to offer himself as a confidant, and she found the whole thing a touch embarrassing, as though she had done something shameful that she could not remember. Fritha shook herself as she reached the foot of the steps. Whatever it was done now, she would just have to grin and wait it out.
Hey, Anoman!
Anoman glanced up at the sound of his name, Fritha tripping lightly up the steps below him, and his hand closed instinctively about the packet he held, small but somehow heavier than perhaps he would have expected considering what it was. The merchant had tried to dissuade him at first, had tried to offer him ones of a more floral scent when he had realized it was to be for a woman, but the knight had remained firm.
Hello, Anoman, have you been waiting long? No, not at all, my lady. Did you get everything you needed?
Fritha shrugged.
Yes, pretty much, though no one I asked has any suitable work for us. Did you find any? I fear not. Oh, well, perhaps the others will have had better luck. Do you mind if I just change my boots? I had to buy some new ones, this pair have been leaking since trade meet.
She gave a laugh that he could not share. It was disheartening to realize the extent of the troubles she just never saw fit to mention to him. She had already jumped up to sit on the plinth next to them, pulling off her old way-worn boots and setting them neatly beside her, before drawing on her new ones with a slow reverence. They were long and narrow, a row of close-set eyelets running from halfway up the back, and they would have easily laced up over her knees, providing ample protection for her legs, though it seemed Fritha had other ideas. He watched as she laced the first loosely to about halfway up her leg, before folding over the excess leather to give the boot a slack, almost careless look. She beamed at the effect, bending closer to tuck away the trailing laces, and Anoman finally took the moment to speak.
Fritha, I have something for you. You have helped me much over this last 10 days or so, and I know that you like to take care of your appearance, even when out of the city. Not that I think about you washing or such.
He added hastily, feeling himself going red as Fritha continued to stare at him with bemused frown.
Well, I saw you had almost run out, so, here.
He handed her the small, plainly wrapped packet, the girl still frowning as she straightened to slowly untie the string and part the paper, before.
Oh, it's soap,
Fritha laughed, smiling at him now and looking almost relieved.
Thank you, Anoman. You didn't have to though. No, but I merely wished to show you that however poorly I express it, I am grateful to you. I do not think I would have passed my test without your guidance.
She laughed again.
I doubt that, Anoman, but thank you for my present.
She brought the smooth yellow disc to her face and inhaled deeply.
Oranges and cinnamon. Yes, it reminded me of midwinter,
he confessed, hoping she would hear this echo of their meeting at the riverside when they had taken sherry together so many days ago, but she just smiled and nodded, and he could not tell if she recalled it or not. She wrapped the soap carefully back in its paper though, placing it in her bag before going back to her laces, the girl fussing over her other boot before she finally seemed satisfied.
Right,
she announced, scooping up her old boots and dropping lightly from the plinth.
I suppose we should get back to the others.
Together they made the way back to the slums, the streets even busier. Now high sun was drawing closer, the pair coming upon the inn just as Jahara appeared at the end of the street, the druid uncharacteristically light-hearted as she called out to them over the bustle.
There she is, cutting a dash in her new boots. Really, Fritha?
She scolded with a much more familiar frown as she reached them.
Do them up properly, you'll break your neck. I like them this way. I'll lace them properly when we're out traveling, but in city they're staying like this.
Jahara's frown remained, the woman clearly undeterred, though another voice forestalled any retort she could have made.
We are the last to return, my birds.
The three turned as one to see the others approaching from the opposite end of the street, Herr Dallas continuing contemplatively as he arrived.
And the raven is newly shod, I see. Very, now what is the word I am search for? Piratical.
He announced decisively after a pause.
Yes, I could see you standing in the prow of a spelljammer, ready to take havoc to the outer plains. I think he means to say your new boots are very nice, Fritha,
added Airy with a fond smile to the tiefling. Fritha laughed.
Well, thank you. So, did you have any joy with the temples? As luck would have it, yes, my raven, but I will let Minsk tell you the tale, for it was by his own well-lain self that we were offered it.
The ranger turned his broad smile on the girl.
We were passing the temple of Lathander, when one of the acolytes did call out to us. He remembered Minsk and Bu from before, when we aided them in the making of their new shrine, and he told us that the Dawn Master Creel may have another task for us all. The Dawn Master was making preparations for the High Sun service when we spoke to him, and asked that we return later that he may explain to us in greater detail the dangers we will be facing.
Minsk, that's brilliant! Enthused Fritha, Jahara nodding, looking pleased as well.
Indeed. Well, there is little point in us standing out here in the street,
she continued, as a rather rowdy group of women jostled past them.
We should head inside if we plan to take lunch. You lot can,
agreed Fritha.
I'm going to head over to the shrine to mask and make my prayers. Why did you steal them?
Quipped Hairdalis with a nod to her new boots. Fritha laughed, going a pleasant shade of pink.
No. Do not be foolish,
scolded Jahara teasingly.
It is because she wants Renal to see her in them.
Fritha was even pinker now, the girl trying to look scandalized, something very difficult to do when you are giggling merrily.
Jahara. Renal?
Questioned Cerned, and Hairdalis nodded.
Yes, Renal Bloodscalp, he is a guild master of the thieves here in the city. He and the Raven share a special acquaintance. Oh, they are courting. No, they are not.
Came Anomen sharply, Fritha calming enough to nod and add,
Indeed, we are just allies of a sort, and as such he may have some work he can put our way, so.
She was cut off as a man, tanned, grey-haired and plainly in hurry, knocked into her as he went past.
Hey, careful there!
The man glanced back, an apology already on his lips.
Sorry, me.
He stopped, his lined face suddenly darkening with a clear contempt as his eyes found him, and Cerned could hardly believe it.
Igarol. Do I know you?
The man grunted with feigned ignorance as he cast an appraising eye over him and half turned to leave again.
No, I do not think I do.
In later years, Cerned would often look back and wonder why he had not just let Igarol go then, when he had worked so hard at distancing himself from his past. Perhaps a part of him had always been still living in that city, clinging to that old life.
Igarol,
he cried, halting his departure with but a word.
You do not remember. I did not say I did not remember you, I said I did not know you.
Igarol sneered, something that looked strange on a face he was only used to seeing smile.
You are but a shadow of the man I once called neighbor. Neighbor?
Questioned Jahara, glancing between them.
Is this man a friend of yours, Cerned?
Igarol shook his head, his voice much warmer as he answered her.
No, miss, none could accuse me of such. I fear this is but a pale reflection of the decent man who once made his living beside me in the promenade.
Cerned ignored the dark looks being shared about him. He would, no doubt, have much to explain later, but now he was more concerned with trying to reconcile himself with the man he had once been glad to call friend.
Igarol, I now serve the lands that once were the foundation of our livelihoods, is that so terrible? Surely you see that my greater duty. Do not speak to me of duty when you are the one who abandoned his wife.
Igarol burst out, suddenly furious.
Wife!
Cried Aerie somewhere behind him.
I did not abandon Galia.
Snapped Cerned, his own temper rising at the injustice of this attack.
I left her well provided for. She understood that my fate was to serve nature, I could no longer stand life in this city.
Igarol merely snorted though, his manner hard.
Nature called and you left. Oh, she understood well enough, but did you? Ah, I am done with you. Good business.
And with that, he turned and marched off to be lost in the crowds once more.
What was all that about?
came Fritha eventually, sounding as taken aback as he felt, and Cern turned away from her to unfortunately catch Jahara's eye instead, the woman sending him a dark look.
I think perhaps we should all go inside and discuss this further over tea,
she offered, her look indicating just who she was expected to do most of the talking. Cern nodded, still feeling shaken, and, in silence, the group filed back into the gloom of the coronet. Cern swallowed, very aware of the 5 pairs of eyes that rested on him. This was it, the life he thought he had left behind had finally caught up with him. He was a fool to think it would not, there in that city where it had all begun. Although perhaps not all was as he had left it, he considered as he thought back to what Igarol had said of Gallia, though thoughts of his wife would have to wait now, an explanation to his companions long overdue. Cern set his cup down before him, and even the din of the surrounding tavern seemed hushed as he drew that first breath.
I was not always like this, neither a druid nor a werewolf. I grew up here in Athkatla though, for as long as I can remember, there was always a duality within me, as though I was 2 people. My father was a potter by trade, and some of my earliest memories were of him taking me out of the city to gather clay from the riverbanks for him and my mother to work. I found the world outside city walls amazing, a land of peace and harmony, so different from the hectic grasping world of the promenade into which I had been born. Even then, I had dreams of leaving my life in the city and going out in the world to serve nature. My father realized this too, though I believe he hoped I would grow out of my fascination. But I did not, and it became a source of tension between us as I grew older. He wanted me to stop daydreaming and settle down, to begin a family of my own and take over the business, just as he had inherited it from his own mother so long ago, but I resisted. Finally, the fates decided it for both of us. My father fell ill. He was examined by healers and clerics both, but nothing helped, and when he knew the end was upon him, he called me to him.
Cern felt a darkness pass over his heart, and for but a moment he was back there, knelt by that bed, watching the frail shadow of the man who had once been his father draw shallow fractured breaths.
Even then, in the face of death, his thoughts were on his family, the man worrying for the wife he would leave behind. I would have done anything to make his passing easier. I swore to him then that I would stop dreaming, that I would take over the business and look after my mother, a kind and gentle woman, as she deserved. We buried my father in the summer of my 20th year, and from that very moment, I threw myself into that life with all my heart. I took over the business, made many good friends, and even took Gallia as my wife. Between us, the pottery grew and flourished. I was well liked and respected by my peers, and a part of me was contented with my life. And yet I found that I lived for those mornings when I left the city to gather the clay, just as I and my father once had.
Cern sighed deeply. Neither reality had been so terrible, he could be living that same parallel life still had it not been for the encounter.
I lived that fractured existence until my 27th winter. The business had grown greatly over the years, much helped by Gallia's skill at the wheel, and increasing amounts of clay were needed to keep up with the demand. Gallia wanted us to begin to purchase our clay instead of collecting it ourselves, but I convinced her to hire Phoenicia instead to help her in the home and the workshop, while I continued to leave the city for even longer periods as I went further into the nearby forests to gather the clay we needed. Sometimes I would be gone for days at a time, spending my days wandering along the riverbanks, my nights just sleeping beneath the trees. Gallia was unhappy, I know, for in spite of it all she loved me truly, but I could not bear to give up my wanderings. And then, on one such trip the fates struck again. I was attacked and bitten by what I thought to be merely a wolf at the time. I assumed it had been driven to seek me as prey by the unusually harsh winter, and I managed to drive it off, though I was soon to discover all was not as it had first seemed. From the very next day, I noticed a change in myself. My senses were sharper, a baser understanding of the world about me flowing through my heart, though it was not until I returned to the city that I realized my true nature. The creature that had bitten me was a werewolf, and now I was one as well. The city that had once been merely a source of slight displeasure was now a confusion of noise and smell, and I realized that, at last, I no longer had a place there. I would like to be able to say I had no choice, but even after I admitted the truth of it to Galia, she stuck by me. Lycanthropy can be managed to a degree with elixirs and magics, though they are expensive. Of course, certain risks would always be present, that I could lose control of myself, that my secret could be discovered, especially in this city where the cowled wizards hold such power, but Galia was willing to do all she could to work with my affliction and allow us to remain together. But truth be told, I no longer wanted to, I was two men no more.
He shook his head, smiling humorlessly.
It is ironic, an affliction that would have caused the greatest of rifts in most people actually made me whole. I was but one man now, and one that belonged out in the wilds. I could not stay. But a month later, I left the city, leaving Galia our business and home as her own, and headed to a grove of druids I knew lived in the marshes just east of Trade Meet, and the rest is as you know.
Right, well, began Fritha after a long pause, the girl sending an unreadable look to the woman next to her, and Jahara frowned, turning back to Cerned.
If Galia was so accepting of your decision, why did that man we met react with such hostility towards you?
Cerned shook his head, as surprised as they had been by a girl's reaction.
I do not know. I cannot believe Galia would have defamed my name in my absence, however upset she may have been at my going.
He glanced to Fritha, aware that it was her goals that were suffering by all this.
I realize I am not in a position to be asking favors of you, but if we have the time, I should like to visit my old home and speak with her.
The girl sighed and nodded vehemently.
To be honest, I think that is a good idea, and the sooner the better too. I do not want this to creep up on us again at some inopportune moment. Indeed,
agreed Jahara,
and I do not think you should attend alone either. The next person you meet may not be so happy to just say their piece and leave you be.
Cerned hesitated a moment, but however awkward the situation may be, there really was nothing he could say against her offer. He nodded once and Fritha smiled grimly.
Well, there's no time like the present. Here,
said Cerned, gesturing to the house they were all gathered before,
this was our home and the pottery both. I do not understand why it is closed up like this.
Fritha let her eyes travel over the frontage before her, the place dark and deserted. Cern's home was one of the many shops and workrooms that were built into the great tiered walls of the promenade. They were quite high up and the air was cooler there, the wind holding a sting it did not seem to have on the ground, the people looking small and ant-like as they scurried about the marketplace below. Fritha drew her gaze away, turning instead to look over those about her. Everyone had wanted to join Cerned in the end, though she considered with a glance to Herr Dallas, some people's reasons for attending seemed to be more altruistic than others, the tiefling looking as though he was enjoying the unfolding drama immensely.
There is a fine layer of dust inside,
offered Jahara, turning back from the window she was looking through.
I do not think anyone has been here for a while.
Cerned frowned, shielding his eyes as he turned to gaze across the promenade.
Our serving woman, Phoenicia, lives just across the way on the southern side, perhaps she will have some idea of what is going on.
And so they filed back down, skirting the marketplace to hike up the tiered walls on the opposite side to almost the same height again, and Fritha hoped the woman still lived there. She was heartily sick of climbing steps by this point, if nothing else. Cern stepped forward, knocking politely on the peeling green door, and there was a slight pause before there came the sound of the bolt being drawn back and the wood slowly swung back to reveal a stout dark-skinned woman of late middle age, her dark curls streaked with grey. Cern smiled genially.
Ah, Phoenicia.
The woman swelled like a bullfrog.
You? Get away from here, dog.
Cern frowned, but seemingly more from surprise than any anger.
Phoenicia, please, I would speak with Gallia. Where is she? Why is our home abandoned? You've a nerve, I'll give you that. Coming back here after what you did. What I did?
The druid repeated, his temper rising.
I did nothing but leave my wife under the most amicable of terms, and I would very much like to know why everyone else would seem to think otherwise. Cern, calm down, this helps no one,
soothed Fritha, the girl placing herself between the pair as Phoenicia shrank further behind the cover of her door, though her manner was no meeker for the retreat.
Oh ho, amicable was it?
The woman continued scornfully,
more like convenient. You realized there was finally something that would keep you from your precious nature forever, and you bolted like the coward you are. And as for Gallia, she is somewhere now that you will never be able to disappoint her again. She is safe from you now, swine, she and the child both.
Child! Cried Cern, clearly astounded, the man wedging a hand against her door as Jahara instinctively grabbed his other arm.
Phoenicia, I demand you tell me of what you speak. No, get out of it!
She shrieked, defiant in her fear, the woman straining to shut her door.
Cern, calm yourself!
Shouted Jahara,
Cern!
He twisted free, lunging forward to try to get to the woman, Fritha moving to hold him back, one arm along his chest, her other hand braced against the woman's doorframe as others rushed to help her.
Cern, stop!
It all happened very quickly, Minsk scooping Cern under his arms to pull him back, and Fritha gave an unearthly scream as the door was unexpectedly freed and instantly slammed shut on her hand. Suddenly everyone stopped. Cern just stood, his eyes closed and breathing deeply, Minsk's hand still on his shoulders, the old woman peering fearfully around the edge of her door as though too scared to even move to shut it again. Fritha was cradling her hand to her chest, hissing curses into it, a no-man hovering at her arm though she ignored him, finally straightening to send the druid a furious glare before turning back to Phoenicia.
Please madam,
she began again politely, though there was definitely an edge to her tone now.
We merely wish to know where Gallia is, then we will go and leave you in peace.
Phoenicia stared defiantly back at them before she sighed defeatedly and shook her head.
Gallia's dead.
Cern looked as though he had just been hit with something very heavy.
What? When? About 6 months ago, at the end of the spring. But how? I don't know.
Cern shook himself, clearly trying to make sense of it all.
But, Phoenicia, what are you speaking of? I don't understand.
The woman sent him a dark look.
No, I don't suppose you would. You may harp on, patting yourself on the back about how you left Gallia the home and the pottery, but you left her with a whole lot more than that.
She paused, her manner grave.
You left her with child, Cern.
Ari gasped. The elf was looking at Cern as though she had never seen him before, while at Fritha's side a no-man was shaking his head darkly, muttering an oath under his breath. Jahara glanced to her and Fritha sent her a look in reply. This would not end well, and they both knew it. Cern was just staring at the woman, his shock seemingly beyond words, the man finally finding his voice to stammer,
But, we had always thought, I mean she had been expecting before, but she could never carry a child to term. Well, she carried this one for a good 8 months after you turned tail and fled,
said Phoenicia with a cruel candor.
You were always so attuned to nature, weren't you? How strange then that you never noticed the signs, or perhaps you did and that was why you finally left her. No.
Cerned cried, almost pleading,
it was not like that. I had no idea. Well, you were the only one after a short while, I can tell you,
Phoenicia snorted humorlessly, sighing deeply as she continued her tale.
So you leave and she's with child, and the baby's without a father. Well, you know as well as I, such children are less than dirt in this city. And then she meets Althendirl, a nobleman from over the river. I don't know anything for certain, but I always suspected he could not father a child of his own. Gallia must have seemed like a gift to him, still so young and fair and already bearing the child he so craved. Gallia did not love him, how could she? He was a dried-up old thing and cold with it.
Phoenicia shook her head, frowning to herself as she remembered some past unease.
Not unkind or choleric, as far as I know, but very cold, he never smiled. But she had more than just herself to think about then, and they were married within the month. I met her a few times after that, once just before her confinement and a couple of times afterwards. Oh, she chattered away easily enough, said she was glad to have borne a healthy son after so many disappointments, but there was always a melancholy to her. Poor girl had a wretched fate, married to 2 men, neither of them caring a whit for her. Then in the spring, I get news that she's fallen sick and died. And so it ends. But why didn't she just tell me she was with child?
Cerned cried, his emotions wavering between frustration and despair. Phoenicia snorted contemptuously.
And have you feel you had to stay because of it and resent them both? Gallia wanted the decision to be yours. Foolish girl, perhaps she thought you would choose her in the end. Well, the decision was yours, Cerned, you made it, you left and now she is dead and your child knows another as father, and I hope your conscience tortures you for it.
The door was slammed shut with force enough to rattle the hinges. Frithla turned away from the peeling wood, moving over to sit on the nearby wall and finally let a gnomon examine her hand. Cerned looked ashen and dazed, the man still staring unblinkingly at the door where the herald of all this misery had just been stood. Frithla wanted to feel sorry for him, indeed, part of her did. But another, more jaded part of her wondered, that for one who went on so about nature and the balance, whether Phoenicia's claims that he had subconsciously noticed something and fled because of it did not hold some small grain of truth. He was muttering quietly to himself now, seemingly distracted as he turned from the door.
I have a son. I can't, why didn't she tell me?
He glanced up suddenly, all fervor.
I have to meet him. Cerned,
ventured Ari quietly in the silence that followed.
You heard what Phoenicia said, he has been taken in by this noble's household.
The druid ignored her.
I have to see him, I have to make sure he is well.
Everyone's eyes seemed to slowly come to rest on her. Frithla sighed.
We can make some inquiries, I suppose. But remember, Cerned, by the law, he is no longer your son, you gave up your rights to him when you left Gallia. I do not care for your laws or rights. Nature has her own laws and my son. Your son? The boy won't even recognize you.
Frithla snapped, her hand was hurting fiercely and this sort of complication really was the last thing they needed.
And we both know what happens to the abandoned by nature's laws. Survival of the fittest, ring any bells? Be thankful this man took the child in to start with. We will look into this matter, Cerned,
continued Jahara, the woman stepping forward to lay a hand on his shoulder, her voice firm and calming,
but we need to do it in our own way, work within the laws of the city. Otherwise we will just make things worse.
Cerned shook his head, his anger replaced by a misery that Frithla found even more worrying.
Things cannot be any worse and I needed no help before.
He turned to stare hopelessly out over the promenade.
By the gods, what have I done?
Jahara shifted slightly, trying to get closer to the bar in her wine, the tall stool heavy and hard to move without standing up again. After the scene at the promenade, the group split up once more, the majority of them heading over to speak with the Dawn Master at the Temple of Lathander, while Fritha went to finally make her prayers over at the Thieves' Guild and see if she couldn't get a quick audience with the Thief Master while she was at it, before they had all retuned to the coronet once more. Jahara smiled to herself, feeling again the overwhelming sense of relief as she thought back to her meeting with Galvary. Fritha did not even know how close she had come to such troubles, and now they were all to be forgotten. She took another sip of the sour red wine, the less than pleasant taste taking her back to the Sea's Bounty where she had drunk with Derman that morning. He was a good friend and an old one too. He had been a veteran within the Harpers even when she had first joined, the man taking her under his wing somewhat, showing her how to work within their ranks, when to hide her feelings and when to let her temper fly. And now, whenever her doubt of Galvary made her question her role, she thought of Derman and the many other faithful friends she counted within the Harpers' ranks and felt vindicated in her trust of them. Jahara started from her reverie as someone drew out the stool next to her and she glanced up to see Fritha sinking onto the seat, the girl offering her a smile and greeting, the barmaid promptly setting another cup of wine before them without a word. Jahara watched as Fritha raised it shakily to her lips, the knuckles of the hand with which she grasped it, a mottled streak of purple.
"How is your hand?"
The girl sighed, setting the cup down to flex her fingers slightly.
"Still a bit stiff. A no-man gave it another check over now the swelling's gone down and there's no permanent damage, why are you smiling?" "Oh, no reason,"
Jahara offered quickly,
"I was just recalling something Herr Dallas said earlier."
They both glanced back to the table to where he was laughing with Minsk, the tiefling teasing Ari as she tried to scold him about something. Fritha grinned wickedly.
"He's such a torment, isn't he? I love it."
Jahara frowned but said nothing.
"At least someone's in a good humor,"
the girl continued, her attention shifting to the table next to them where Cern sat alone, brooding into a large flagon of ale.
"Not that you can blame him. Must have all been a bit of a shock for him today."
Jahara sighed.
"He will not let this rest, you know, it could cause complications for us."
Fritha took another sip of wine, nodding dully.
"Yes, I know."
She sighed deeply.
"Nothing's ever simple, eh? I asked Renal about this Dirl fellow once I finally got over there this afternoon, but as far as Renal knows, or says he knows, at least, he's just another nobleman. At least we've managed to find some work for ourselves though."
"Yes," agreed Jahara, thinking back to their earlier meeting with the Dawn Master,
"though I would prefer it if Creel had been able to be a touch clearer on what we will need to face." A game amongst children at the local temple school sees a young boy disappeared into the city crypts along with the 3 priests sent after him, and now all of them are gone without a trace.
Fritha shook her head, looking sad.
"The poor lamb, he must be so frightened."
Jahara imagined that after being missing for 3 days he was likely dead, but she did not say this. A body had yet to be found after all, and only a creature of some sentience would take the trouble to hide one. She glanced to the girl next to her.
"Do you think this vampire guild could be behind it?"
Fritha frowned slightly.
"I'm not sure they would want to. As the sages say, never fight a war on 2 fronts. They would be unwise to invite the anger of such a powerful church when they are already at war with the shadow thieves."
Jahara nodded. For all her foolishness, Fritha had a very sensible head on her shoulders.
"That would make sense."
Fritha smiled, downing the last of her wine in one mouthful and suppressing a shudder as she swallowed, the girl still clearly feeling the after effects of last night's excesses.
"Well, That's it for me now, I need an early night.
Fritha dropped lightly from the stool and headed for the stairs, only to run into a gnome as he descended into the tavern. Jahara watched the pair's brief exchange, the knight gesturing to her hand as they spoke, Fritha smiling and nodding as she replied before he bowed slightly and they parted, Fritha disappearing upstairs. A gnome turned back to the room to catch her watching and Jahara hid her smile in her cup. End of chapter.